The laughter died so suddenly that even the Roots stopped their background music. Jimmy Fallon, mid-clap, froze as he watched Jurden's face transform from comedic confidence to something raw and vulnerable. What had started as a typical Tuesday night taping at Studio 6B was about to become something no one in that room would ever forget. Jay had been killing it. His set about Gen Z's intensity and visiting the zoo had the audience roaring with laughter. Jimmy was doing what he did best, encouraging the crowd, throwing in his signature reactions, creating that perfect late-night energy that made The Tonight Show feel like a party everyone wished they could attend. But then something shifted. It happened during Jay's bit about generational differences. He was riffing about how his mother never understood social media, making jokes about her confusion with technology. The audience was eating it up. Jimmy was grinning from his host's desk, occasionally letting out those genuine laughs that made guests feel like they were hanging out with their funniest friend. "My mom used to call me every time she saw me on TV," Jay said, his voice carrying that practiced comedian timing. She'd be like, "Jay, I saw you on that computer show again." I'd say, "Mom, it's called YouTube." She'd say, "Well, whatever it's called, you looked skinny." The audience laughed. Jimmy chuckled, but something in Jay's voice had changed. The practice delivery was still there, but underneath it, Jimmy caught something else. A tremor. A cat. The kind of sound that comes when someone is trying to stay strong but the weight of memory threatens to break through. Jimmy's comedian instincts were finely tuned after years of hosting. He could sense when a guest was uncomfortable, when a bit wasn't landing, when the energy needed to be redirected. But this was different. This wasn't about comedy timing. This was about pain bleeding through the performance. Jay continued his set, but Jimmy noticed his hands. They were gripping the microphone tighter than necessary. His shoulders were more rigid, and when he smiled, it didn't quite reach his eyes, the way it had moments before. "She never quite got the comedy thing," Jay said, attempting to move into his next bit. "She'd watch my sets and say, 'Why don't you tell nice stories instead?' I'd explain that comedy is about finding humor in truth. And she'd say, 'Well, the truth is you need to call more often.'" The audience laughed again, but Jimmy saw it. Jay's voice cracked slightly on the word truth, not enough for most people to notice. But Jimmy had been doing this long enough to catch the subtle signs when someone was fighting to hold it together. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that would define this moment forever. Instead of letting Jay continue with his prepared material, instead of maintaining the flow that kept late-night television moving at its perfect pace, Jimmy did something unprecedented. He stood up from his desk. The audience didn't think much of it at first. Jimmy often moved around during segments, especially when he was really enjoying a guest's performance. But the production team in the control room immediately sensed something was different. Jimmy's movement wasn't part of any planned blocking. This was instinctual. Jay was in the middle of setting up his next joke when he noticed Jimmy approaching. The studio lights caught the concern in Jimmy's eyes, and suddenly Jay's carefully constructed comedic persona began to crack. "Hey Jay," Jimmy said softly, his voice cutting through the microphone system with unexpected gentleness. "Hold up for a second." The audience fell quiet. This wasn't part of any segment they recognized. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in Studio 6B sensed they were witnessing something unscripted, something real. Jimmy reached Jay at center stage and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You okay, man?" It was such a simple question. 3 words that people ask each other hundreds of times a day, without really expecting an honest answer. But the way Jimmy asked it, with genuine concern and attention, in front of 300 studio audience members and millions watching at home, it hit Jay like a revelation. No one had asked him that question in months. Not really asked it. Not in a way that invited truth instead of deflection. Jay looked at Jimmy, then at the audience, then back at Jimmy. His comedic training told him to make a joke, to deflect, to keep the show moving. But something in Jimmy's eyes, something in the way he was standing there, present and patient, broke down Jay's defenses. "My mom," Jay said quietly, his voice barely audible even with the microphone. "My mom died 6 months ago." The studio went completely silent. Even the crew members who had seen hundreds of shows, who prided themselves on maintaining professional detachment, stopped what they were doing and focused entirely on this moment. Jimmy's expression softened immediately. This wasn't the talk show host Jimmy Fallon anymore. This was just Jimmy, a man who understood loss, who recognized grief even when it was wrapped in punchlines and practiced delivery. "I'm so sorry," Jimmy said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had experienced his own heartbreak. "Do you want to talk about her?" Jay stood there for a moment, microphone in hand, looking at this man who had created a space for truth in the middle of what was supposed to be entertainment. The audience waited. The cameras rolled, and Jay made a choice that would change everything. "She watched every single one of my TV appearances," Jay said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Every late-night set, every comedy special, every random clip that ended up online. She'd call me the next day with notes." Jimmy smiled genuinely. "What kind of notes?" "She'd say things like, 'That joke about your father was funny, but maybe don't tell people about his drinking problem on national television.'" Jay's voice cracked slightly, but he continued. "Or she'd say, 'I loved that story about Mississippi, but you forgot to mention how beautiful the sunsets are there.'" The audience was completely absorbed now. This wasn't just comedy anymore. This was a son talking about his mother, and everyone in that room could feel the love and loss in every word. "She had this theory," Jay continued, looking directly at Jimmy now, as if he was talking to a friend rather than performing for an audience. "She said comedy was just another way of loving people, that when I made people laugh, I was giving them a little bit of joy, and that was the same as giving them love." Jimmy's eyes began to glisten. He moved closer to Jay, creating an even more intimate space within the larger theater. "She sounds incredible," Jimmy said softly. "She was," Jay replied, and now the tears were coming freely. "And the thing is, she never got to see me really make it. She never got to see me on your show. She died 2 weeks before I got the call that I was booked." The silence in the studio was profound. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness or discomfort. It was the silence of 300 people holding their breath together, witnessing something sacred. "But here's the thing," Jay said, his voice finding strength again. "The last conversation I had with her, she told me something I didn't understand then, but I think I understand now." Jimmy waited, creating space for whatever Jay needed to say. "I was scared about this booking. I called her from the hospital parking garage because I was too nervous to go upstairs and see her while she was sick. I told her I didn't think I was ready for the Tonight Show, that I didn't think I was good enough, that I was afraid I'd mess it up." Jay paused, looking out at the audience, then back at Jimmy. "And she said, 'Jay, baby, you've been ready your whole life. You just don't know it yet. When you get on that stage, don't try to be funny. Just try to be yourself. Because the person you are, that person is worth loving.'" The words hung in the air like a blessing. Jimmy felt his own eyes filling with tears, remembering his own mother, his own fears, his own moments of doubt before big opportunities. "She said, 'And when you're up there, remember that I'll be watching, maybe not with my eyes, but with my heart, and I'll be proud.'" Jimmy couldn't hold back anymore. Without thinking about cameras or audiences or late-night television protocol, he pulled Jay into a hug. Not a quick, camera-friendly embrace, but a real hug. The kind of hug that says, "I see you, I hear you, and you're not alone." The audience erupted, but not in the typical way. This wasn't applause for entertainment. This was applause for humanity, for connection, for the courage it takes to be vulnerable in front of strangers. When Jimmy and Jay finally separated, Jimmy kept his hands on Jay's shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. "Jay," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "she was right, you are worth loving. And she is watching. I can feel her watching right now." Jimmy turned slightly toward the cameras, toward the millions of people watching at home. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "Sometimes the best comedy comes from the deepest truth. And the truth is, Jurden's mother raised an incredible human being, someone who makes people laugh, not because he's trying to get something from them, but because he's trying to give something to them." He turned back to Jay. "That's what love looks like, man. That's what your mom was talking about." Jay wiped his eyes and smiled, the first completely genuine smile he'd given all evening. "You know what?" Jay said into his microphone. "Let me tell you about the woman who taught me everything I know about making people feel loved." What followed wasn't the set Jay had prepared. It wasn't the polished material designed to go viral or generate clips for social media. Instead, Jay told stories about his mother, her wisdom, her humor, her way of making everyone feel special, her belief that laughter was just love wearing a different outfit. The audience was mesmerized. They laughed, but they also cried. They felt like they were being welcomed into something intimate and beautiful, like they were getting to know both Jay and his mother through his words. Jimmy sat on the edge of his desk, not moderating or guiding the conversation, just listening, just being present, just creating space for this moment that had transformed from entertainment into something approaching ministry. When Jay finally finished, the standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. But more importantly, something had shifted in that studio. The audience wasn't just entertained. They were moved. They felt like they had been part of something meaningful. As the credits rolled and the audience filed out, many people commented that they felt different leaving than they had arriving. They felt more connected, not just to Jay and Jimmy, but to their own experiences of love and loss. Jay's appearance became one of the most watched segments in The Tonight Show's recent history. Not because it was funny, though it was, but because it was real. Because it showed what happens when someone creates space for truth in a world that often prioritizes performance over authenticity. 6 months later, Jay dedicated his first comedy special to his mother. In the dedication, he wrote, "For Mom, who taught me that making people laugh is just another way of loving them. Thank you for watching." The special opened with a clip from his Tonight Show appearance, the moment when Jimmy asked if he was okay, and Jay chose to answer honestly. But the story didn't end there. Behind the scenes that night, something extraordinary happened. As the studio emptied and the crew began breaking down the set, Jimmy found Jay sitting alone in his dressing room, still processing what had just occurred. "I can't believe I just did that," Jay said, looking up as Jimmy knocked on the open door. "I had a whole set planned, and I just threw it all away." Jimmy sat down across from him, still in his show clothes but with his tie loosened, looking more like a friend than a host. "You didn't throw anything away," Jimmy said gently. "You gave everyone in that room something they'll never forget, including me." Jay looked at him questioningly. "My mom died when I was young too," Jimmy said quietly. "And there are still nights when I'm performing, when I'm trying to make people laugh, when I wonder if she can see me. If she's proud. What you did tonight, sharing your mom's words like that, it reminded me that love doesn't end just because someone can't physically be here anymore." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two comedians who had found something deeper than laughter together. "The thing is," Jay said finally, "I've been carrying her last words around like this heavy secret, like if I said them out loud, it would make her death more real somehow. But saying them tonight, sharing them with all those people, it didn't make the grief heavier. It made it lighter somehow." Jimmy nodded. "That's what connection does. It takes the weight off our shoulders and spreads it around so we're not carrying it alone anymore." Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. The clip of Jay's emotional moment went viral, but not in the typical way late-night content usually spreads. Instead of quick laughs and instant entertainment, people were sharing it with messages like, "This made me call my mom," and "This reminded me why I love comedy, and I needed to hear this today." Jay received hundreds of messages from people sharing their own stories about losing parents, about carrying last words, about finding the courage to be vulnerable. Comedy clubs started hosting truth nights, where comedians were encouraged to share personal stories alongside their jokes. Jimmy, meanwhile, found himself changed by the experience. He began paying closer attention to his guests, looking for those moments when someone might need more than just a platform for promotion. He started ending each show, not just with thank yous, but with genuine wishes for his guests' well-being. The Tonight Show received letters from viewers, saying the episode had inspired them to have difficult conversations with their own families, to share their own truths, to stop waiting for perfect moments to express love. 3 months after the taping, Jay called Jimmy with an update that brought tears to the host's eyes. "I got a call from my dad today," Jay said. "We haven't talked much since Mom died. He's not great with emotions, you know? But he said he watched the show, and he wanted me to know that Mom would have been proud. And then he said something I never expected." Jimmy waited. He said, "Your mom always told me you had a gift for making people feel less alone. Now I understand what she meant." Jimmy felt his own eyes well up. "Jay, that's beautiful. But here's the really crazy part," Jay continued. "He told me he's been watching all my sets online. All of them. Since Mom died. He's been trying to understand what she saw in my comedy. And he said tonight, after watching our show together, he finally gets it. He said, 'You're not just making people laugh, son. You're making them feel loved.'" When Jay's comedy special aired, it opened not just with the Tonight Show clip, but with a dedication sequence that featured home videos of his mother watching his early performances, laughing at his jokes, beaming with pride. The sequence ended with her voice, recorded on an old answering machine message. "Jay, baby, I just watched your set online. You made me laugh so hard I cried happy tears. Keep making people feel loved, sweetheart. That's your superpower." The special became one of the most watched comedy specials of the year, not because it was the funniest, but because it was the most honest. Critics called it comedy as healing and laughter through tears. Jimmy attended the special's premiere, and during the after party, he pulled Jay aside. "Your mom was right," Jimmy said. "You do have a superpower, but it's not just making people laugh. It's making them feel safe enough to feel everything." Jay smiled, thinking of that night 6 months earlier when a simple question had changed everything. "You know what the best part is?" Jay said. "Every time I perform now, I can feel her watching. Not with sadness, but with joy. Like she's proud that I finally understood what she was trying to teach me all along." As the party continued around them, two comedians stood together, understanding that the best comedy doesn't come from avoiding truth, but from embracing it completely. And somewhere, in the laughter filling the room, they could both feel the presence of love that transcends even death itself. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth about love. And sometimes, that truth changes everything.